Gustave Moreau was a French artist and an important figure in the Symbolist movement. Jean Cassou called him the Symbolist painter par excellence. He was an influential forerunner of Symbolism in the visual arts in the 1860s and at the height of the Symbolist movement in the 1890s. He was among the most significant painters. Art historian Robert Delacroix wrote that Moreau brought Symbolist polyvalence to its highest point in Jupiter and Semele. He was a prolific artist who produced over 15,000 paintings, watercolors, and drawings. Moreau painted allegories and traditional biblical and mythological subjects, favored by the fine art academies. Joris Karl Huysmans wrote, "Gustave Moreau has given new freshness to dreary old subjects by a talent both subtle and ample. He has taken myths worn out by the repetitions of centuries, and expressed them in a language that is persuasive and lofty, mysterious and new. The female characters from the Bible and mythology that he so frequently depicted came to be regarded by many as the archetypical symbolist woman. His art fell from favor and received little attention in the early 20th century. But, beginning in the 1960s and 70s, he has come to be considered among the most paramount of Symbolist painters." Gustave Moreau was born in Paris, into a cultured, upper-middle-class family. His father, Louis-Jean-Marie Moreau, was an architect. And his mother, née Adèle Pauline de Motier, a musician. As a child, Moreau was frail around the age of 8. He began to draw incessantly. In 1841, young Moreau, then 15 years old, traveled to Italy for the first time with his mother, aunt, and uncle. Upon their return in 1841, he began attending a studio where he painted in the evenings. In 1844, Moreau became a pupil of François-Edouard Picot, a neoclassical painter. 1846, he entered the École des Beaux-Arts. Moreau had grand ambitions of winning the prestigious Grand Prix de Rome. But he failed to make the final cut in 1848 and 1849. And left the École des Beaux-Arts midway through his career. Although his style soon moved away from that favored by the Academy, many of the basic techniques and concepts he learned at the École des Beaux-Arts remained with him for the rest of his life, as did his commitment to history painting. Moreau spent time copying paintings at the Louvre, and was immediately drawn to Romanticism. Two contemporary artists he greatly admired were Delacroix and Théodore Chassériau. Chassériau entered the private studio of the great neoclassical painter Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres at the age of 10 and later spent time with Ingres at the French Academy in Rome. But in his late teens Chassériau never attended the École des Beaux-Arts. But his drive and diligence established his reputation, earned him commissions, and led a rather freewheeling and sometimes tumultuous life. Moreau befriended Chassériau, who was 7 years his senior, and rented a studio near Chassériau. Moreau's father purchased the house in 1853, and turned its top floor into Moreau's studio. Moreau and his parents spent the rest of their lives there. Shortly before the move, Moreau began an ambitious painting, entitled, A Scene of Epic Slaughter, based on an episode of the Odyssey titled The Suitors. He worked on the painting intermittently for the rest of his life, even adding small pieces of canvas to enlarge the work to a monumental size of 3.85 by 3.43 meters. But eventually died unfinished. Moreau began showing his work regularly in the 1850s. Since 1848, Moreau has drawn inspiration from the Pietà in Eugène Delacroix's Saint-Denis du Sacrement church. Moreau then created the Pietà. Thanks to his father's connections, Moreau's Pietà was purchased by the state in 1851 for the modest sum of 600 francs. The 1853 Salon exhibited Darius fleeing after the Battle of Arbela, and Song of Songs, both showing Chassériau's influence. The latter purchased by the state for 2,000 francs for the Dijon Museum. In 1854 he was commissioned by the state to create Athenians being delivered to the Minotaur in the Cretan labyrinth. The work was exhibited at the Paris Exposition Universelle of 1855. And was purchased by the Bourg-en-Bresse Museum for 4,000 francs. In 1856, Chassériau became ill and died at the young age of 37 on October 10, 1856. Delacroix noted in his journal, "Funeral procession of poor Chassériau. I saw Dauzats, Diaz, and the young Moreau. I quite like him." Moreau began work on The Young Man and Death in 1856. Completed it in 1865, and dedicated it to Chassériau. After Chassériau's death in 1856, Moreau sadly withdrew from public life. And his parents, concerned about his condition, encouraged him to travel to Italy again. In September 1857, Moreau began studying in Rome at his own expense. And on this second trip to Italy, which lasted until 1859, Moreau visited Rome, Florence, Milan, Pisa, Siena, Naples, and Venice. He came to Italy for an extended period of study, to make up for having dropped out of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. After taking in the sights, he began to study and copy art in earnest. He spent the better part of 2 months in the Sistine Chapel, spending 7 to 8 hours a day copying figures from the ceiling. During his stay in Italy, around 1858, Moreau became acquainted with Edgar Degas. Moreau became a mentor to Degas during his stay in Italy. In August 1858, Moreau's parents also came to Italy. His father had just retired and was particularly interested in architecture. In September 1859, Moreau and his parents returned to Paris with hundreds of drawings and paintings. Back in Paris, Edgar Degas painted a small portrait of Moreau in 1860. That hung in Moreau's studio for the rest of his life. However, their relationship began to deteriorate, as Degas soon came under the influence of Edouard Manet and the Impressionists. While Moreau continued to concentrate on history painting. Moreau once remarked to Degas, "You pretend to be able to renew art through ballet?" To which Degas replied, "And you think you will be able to do it by jewelry?" Moreau began to reflect the results of his time in Italy in his painting style. And he spent the first few years of the 1860s working on Oedipus and the Sphinx. Moreau traveled to Italy to study with the masters of the Renaissance. And continued his studies after returning to Paris, renewing his artistic style. The result was Oedipus and the Sphinx, which made a sensational return to the art world at that year's Salon. The painting is now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, USA. Moreau made more than 30 preparatory drawings for the painting, 10 of which were studies of large birdwings for the Sphinx. Moreau depicts Oedipus confronting the Sphinx and challenging the riddle. Oedipus, holding a spear, stands in a contrapposto pose on a rocky outcrop in the mountains, while the Sphinx leaps at Oedipus and claws at his chest. Oedipus is trying to deflect himself from the monster, but the Sphinx courageously stares back at him, waiting for Oedipus to answer. The bodies and bones of the sacrificed lie beneath the cliff at his feet, indicating the cruelty of the Sphinx. figs and laurel shrubs grow at both ends of the screen. A chalice stands on a pedestal. Overlapping the laurel, with a serpent entwined below and a butterfly dancing above. The laurel symbolizes victory, while the fig on the far left symbolizes original sin. And the jewelry of the Sphinx is depicted as a symbol of material wealth. The butterfly, symbolizing the soul, escapes from the serpent, symbolizing death. In a scene that resonates with the laurel and suggests Oedipus and the Sphinx. In the 1870s, disturbed by criticism that his work had become formulaic, he stopped exhibiting for a few years while he concentrated on renewing his art. In 1876 he completed Salome Dancing before Herod, which announced a more painterly style that would characterize his later works. He was made a Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur in 1875 and was promoted to an Officier de la Légion d'honneur in 1883. The subject matter is taken from the New Testament, depicting Salometh, daughter of Herod II, and Herodias dancing before Herod Antipas. The work took Moreau 7 years to paint. The work depicts a magnificent and extraordinarily ornate palace, where Salome, standing on the tips of her toes, is performing a dance for Herod. She is wearing a sumptuously bejeweled costume, holding a lotus flower in her right hand, and extending her left arm in a rigid gesture. She appears frozen, or at most moving in a dead march. In the middle, King Herod is depicted, sitting on the throne and facing the forwards, with an executioner standing on the right, and a musician and Herodias on the left. The most astounding element of this work is the fusion of different cultural elements. These have been associated with the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, the Alhambra in Granada, the Mosque Cathedral of Córdoba, and several mediaeval cathedrals. Motifs have been identified from Etruscan, Roman, Egyptian, Indian, and Chinese art and culture. Here is another of Moreau's masterpieces. The subject of this painting is also taken from the New Testament, and depicts a Salome. As a reward for her dancing at the banquet, Salome is seduced by her mother and asks for the head of John the Baptist. Traditionally, she is shown holding the severed head on a silver tray. But Moreau has rearranged the scene. John's head, which had been treated as an object, floats in the air, dripping with blood, and looks straight at Salome, who also looks back at him unabashedly. The exquisite details of the interior decorations and costumes reinforce the fantastic atmosphere of the painting. Moreau has painted many works based on the mythical female Salome. This painting has the same composition and title, but is available in oil and watercolor. The oil painting, The Apparition, is in the Musée National Gustave Moreau, and the watercolor is in the Louvre. Incidentally, The Young Man and Death, which I mentioned earlier, also has watercolors. Moreau increasingly withdrew from society in his later years. He stopped exhibiting at the Salon, and refused to exhibit abroad. However, he continued to produce paintings and sporadically exhibited his work in other venues, such as the 1889 Paris World's Fair. He occasionally entertained guests at his townhome and was known for his engaging conversation. But visitors were rarely allowed in his studio to see his work. He was exceptionally cultivated, erudite, and a voracious reader. With a personal library of over 1,600 volumes. Compared to other artists who had achieved his level of success in Paris at that time. He lived a fairly modest lifestyle. Edgar Degas, who lived nearby and occasionally still interacted with him, described Moreau in later years as a hermit who knows what time the trains leave. Moreau was elected to the École des Beaux-Arts in 1888. But declined the professorship and classes. And was relieved of all formal obligations by the Dean Paul Dubois. However, on his deathbed, Élie Delaunay, a close friend since Roman times, asked Moreau to succeed him as director of one of the school's main ateliers. In January 1892, at the age of 65. He was appointed professor and studio director. However, Moreau was a contrast to the academic artists of the École des Beaux-Arts. Moreau's classes quickly attracted the most progressive and adventurous students between 1891 and 1898. Some 125 students studied in Moreau's studio. Among them were Henri Matisse and Georges Rouault. Moreau did not try to impose his views or style on his students. He provided them with a stimulating atmosphere and intellectual encouragement to follow his own ideas. He took his students to the Louvre to study and imitate the masters. This was unprecedented at the École des Beaux-Arts. Matisse said, "It was an almost revolutionary attitude on his part to show us the way to the museum." Students were invited to his home on Sunday afternoons. And occasionally he visited his students. However, students were not allowed to see Moreau's studio. Matisse had been denied admission to the École des Beaux-Arts. But Moreau saw him drawing in the public courtyard of the school and invited him to join his class, exempting him from the entrance examination. Matisse soon became the central figure among a faction of students in Moreau's studio that developed into the Fauvist. Moreau produced more than 15,000 paintings, watercolors, and drawings during his lifetime. Because of his reluctance to sell his work, he owned 1,200 paintings and watercolors and 10,000 drawings, which he left to the country after his death. Around 1884, Moreau began cataloguing his paintings, and the idea of leaving his home to the country as a museum led him to renovate the house in 1895, expanding the small studio on the top floor into a larger exhibition space. At the time, artists' house museums were very rare and unprecedented in France. So the government was hesitant to accept the legacy. The Musée National Gustave Moreau opened to the public on January 14, 1903. With his former student Georges Rouault appointed curator. After about a year of declining health, Moreau died of stomach cancer on April 18, 1898, and was buried in his parents' grave in the Montmartre Cemetery in Paris. He left instructions that his death should not be announced in the press. His funeral was to be very small and simple. Gustave Moreau's education in classical drawing did not stop him from experimenting with different styles of art. By traveling to other countries such as Italy or Holland and reading publications, Moreau was able to develop his unique form of art. He started his career drawing classical art. But by incorporating exotic images he developed a mysterious and unique form of art. Finally, here are some words from Moreau. "I believe neither in what I touch nor in what I see and only in what I feel. My brain and my reason seem to be ephemeral and of dubious reality. My inner feeling alone appears to me eternal and unquestionably certain." Thank you very much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. Well then, let's meet in the next video. See you again.